Welcome to The Explainer. What if you could grasp the biggest pressures shaping our world just by looking at a single day's headlines? Well, that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're taking a snapshot of August 4th, 2025, to see how the news reveals the much bigger forces at play.
So the big question is, what can one day really tell us? Turns out, a whole lot. We're going to connect the dots between events that seem totally separate and show you how they're all part of one single, interconnected story. A story about a world that's really feeling the strain.
All right, let's start where the heat is on, where the pressure is most intense. We're talking about the flashpoints, the immediate human and political crises that are happening right now.
First up, Gaza. Some new and frankly really distressing video has surfaced. It shows severely malnourished Israeli hostages just pleading for help. And as you can imagine, these images are dramatically ramping up the international calls for a ceasefire. It's putting immense pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu's government to get a deal done.
Okay, at the exact same time, another crisis is hitting a boiling point. The U.S. Special Envoy, Steve Witkoff, he's on his way to Moscow, and the timing is critical. This is happening just before an August 8th ultimatum from President Trump. The threat? New sanctions on Russia's absolutely vital oil exports if a ceasefire in Ukraine doesn't happen. Now, if you're in Kyiv, you're watching this with, some cautious hope, wondering if this high-stakes game of chicken will finally turn into real, tangible support.
And this just perfectly captures the sheer complexity of what Ukraine is dealing with. You've got President Zelenskyy visiting troops right on the front lines near Volshansk. But the fight isn't just on the battlefield, not even close. At the same time, he's having to condemn drone attacks on medics, file corruption charges over military drone deals, and his government just announced they've thwarted a bombing plot and hit a Russian airfield in Crimea. It's a country fighting a war on literally every single front you can imagine.
So, we've got these intense crises flaring up in different corners of the globe. But what if they're not separate? What if they're connected? Let's pull back the camera a bit and look at the bigger geopolitical picture, because none of this is happening in a vacuum. Analysts are starting to put a name to this pattern. They're calling it the axis of upheaval. Now, this isn't some formal treaty they all signed. Think of it more as an informal club of nations, and they all share one big goal: to push back against the current global order and set up their own alternative power structures.
And who are the key players in this club? Well, security analysts point to four nations: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. What they're doing, ramping up their military, economic, and strategic ties, that's the web that connects everything. It links those flashpoints we just talked about in Ukraine and the Middle East. It turns what looks like separate fires into one big, coordinated strategic challenge.
Now, with all this global tension simmering, it's probably no surprise that it's causing some serious jitters in the economy. But here's the twist. It's not just the economy that's uncertain. Now the very data we use to measure it is being questioned.
A perfect example of this, today's U.S. monthly payroll report. Look, the markets were geared up for a pretty solid number, but what we got was way lower. And that disappointment, it immediately sent a shiver through the markets, and any hope for an interest rate cut just got kicked down the road, probably to September at the very earliest.
Okay, so here's the kicker. Almost right after this weak jobs report drops, President Trump announces he's going to name a new head for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the actual agency that puts these numbers together. And this all comes at a time when there are already growing worries about whether we can even trust the official data.
This just brings up a huge question for all of us, doesn't it? When we're in a shaky economy and the very numbers we rely on to navigate it are being questioned from the top, what can you actually believe? Who do you trust?
And this whole theme, pressure, uncertainty, this erosion of trust, it's not just happening with world politics or the economy. Nope, it's also playing out right now in a huge battle for control over our digital lives.
Let's look at the UK. They just put their new Online Safety Act into effect. On paper, the goal sounds great. Regulate stuff online to keep people, especially kids, safe. But it's kicked off a massive, fierce debate. Why? Because critics are saying it's a huge threat to free speech and privacy. They're especially worried about marginalized groups who often need online anonymity to stay safe. See the pattern? It's that same fundamental tension we just saw with the economic data. A fight between top-down control and personal freedom, only this time, the battleground is the internet.
Okay, so after all this chaos, political, economic, digital, our last story today takes a hard turn. We're pivoting away from all these global problems and looking at a potential solution, one that's being built quite literally from the ground up.
12. I know, it doesn't sound like a huge number, right? But that's the number of brand new, cutting-edge inventor companies that Toyota just brought on board for its super ambitious Woven City project in Japan. This is a big signal that they're hitting the accelerator on this thing.
And listen, this isn't just some sci-fi concept on a whiteboard. Woven City is a real place, a living, breathing laboratory for figuring out the future of how we get around and how we live in cities. And Phase 1, it's launching next month, September 25th. So it represents a totally different kind of answer to all these global pressures we've been talking about. It's not another treaty, it's not another law, it's a real-world experiment, a city of the future being built at the base of Mount Fuji.
So, when we step back and look at everything that happened on this one day, what do we see? We see a world defined by immense pressure, by shifting power dynamics, and by trust that's starting to wear thin. And it leaves us with a really critical question, doesn't it? As we look to the future, where do we place our bets? Do we look for answers in new geopolitical alliances, in more top-down laws, or do we find it by building something completely new, from the ground up, like a brand new city from scratch?